planning or parenting, mental health. Maybe if you, as a group, if something that you guys are discussing and you want to learn more about, please send an email or talk to any of the board members. And inshallah, we'll try to do our best to bring some experts in from the field, from our community. MashaAllah, we have a very talented community all over Metro Detroit, so I'm sure we have experts in almost every field. But without us knowing what is a topic of interest, it's hard for us to present these topics. So if anyone of you have any good ideas, please do let us know, and inshallah we'll do our best. So tonight, inshallah, we have a program about Islamic wills and estate planning. We have our Imam Mufti Wahajuddin and Brother Adil Dawoodi, inshallah, here tonight. So we'll start out with Imam Muhaj to give us a brief Islamic overview regarding wills and estate planning, inshallah.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبنا وحبيب رب العالمين. First, Jazakumullah khairah to everybody coming and participating in this event. And as Dr. Arafat said, inshallah, please let us know about other events that you'd be interested in, inshallah, so we can keep building on this momentum. Now, it's common, we commonly hear the phrase that things are from the cradle to the grave. And people, they apply this to Islam as well. They say, our deen, it's from the cradle to the grave. Everything from your aqiqah to your janazah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains the way that it needs to be done. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam explained how it needs to be done. But in fact, Islam goes beyond the grave. It's not okay to say that Islam is cradle to the grave. Islam goes beyond the grave. Because our Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has informed us, even after a person dies, they continue to receive good deeds, or if they did things in an improper manner, they may receive bad deeds as well in their grave. In a famous hadith in Abu Dawood, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that a person, they may do everything right, they may worship Allah, man or woman, for 60 years, but due to distributing their will or making their will in an improper and unfair manner, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can invalidate 60 years of their ibadah. So this will and estate planning, though it comes after our death, it's the ultimate testament to our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not saying that when I die, I don't have any headaches anymore. No, even after I die, I want to make sure that my legacy that's left in this world, all of those things that I temporarily had in this world, they're given in a manner in which my Rabb subhanahu wa ta'ala will be happy with me. Now, as far as the shares that go in inheritance, that many scholars can tell you. You could go and you could ask them, I have this many family members, where does the, who gets how much? However, how do we practically execute this in this country? If I were to tell, so and so, okay, your sons will get this much, your daughter will get this much, your father will get this much, your mother will get this much, your spouse will get this much, you could write it down on a paper, great. And if you, and inshallah, Allah bless you all with a long life, but whenever you pass away, if this paper is just taken and shown to everyone, it's not going to have any weight in the court of law. You're probably going to end up in probate court or somewhere else, as Brother Adil is going to explain. So how do we make it such that we can avoid all of that? And that our wealth goes to the people whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants it to go to, and it's not eaten up in unnecessary court fees. Years don't go by until people get their inheritance. Inshallah, that's why you have Brother Adil here today. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him for taking the time out and coming. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this event very beneficial. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Jazakumullah khairan, Imam Sam. So just to give you guys a background about Brother Adil Dawoodi, he completed his law about 13 or 14 years ago from Thomas Cooley in Lansing. And he's been practicing corporate transactions and estate planning for the past 13 to 14 years. He has an office in Canton as well as in Lansing. And alhamdulillah, he's given time out to come here tonight to speak to us about this very important topics. So without further ado, inshallah, I'll hand the mic over to him.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. First off, I'm going to apologize. I was not expecting this crowd. So alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair. Thank you for everyone coming out. Clearly, I wasn't expecting it because I only brought 30 or 40 of the pamphlets, and I look and alhamdulillah, they're all gone. So I apologize for that. Inshallah, from the conversation today, I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has. And if anybody would like one of the booklets, I can always plan to mail it out. So as a quick introduction, just to reintroduce myself, my name is Adil Dawoodi. Again, as mentioned, I'm practicing for about 13 or 14 years now. Alhamdulillah, actually, about 10 years ago, I used to go around to masjids all across Michigan and do this very talk. To all the way to Flint, to Grand Rapids, the Lansing, Detroit areas, and I mean, alhamdulillah, even here, I was here maybe 8-9 years ago to do this very topic. The only difference between then and now is I've got more white hair, but the conversation and the topic is the same, inshallah. I try to keep my presentation about 20 to 25 minutes or so itself, because usually around the attention span that I usually see that I get. So alhamdulillah, if there are any questions, I think we're going to have a Q&A right after this as well. So inshallah, if there is any questions, I'd be happy to stay and help answer those. Obviously, the objective of today, I want to get into that a little bit. So part of the overview of what we want to cover, there's 3 areas of conversation or discussion that I want to have. And first off is having the very basic conversation of what is estate planning. We'll get into a little bit about that just to make sure we're all on the same page and on a very high level, and everybody understands when we talk about estate planning, what does that actually mean? Second, we want to talk about is, why do I need one? We just had a brief conversation on that, in terms of what that is, why it's important, and we'll very briefly go into that aspect as well. The area that I'm going to focus on probably the most is going to be on this one. What is the difference between a trust and a will? That is probably the most discussed conversation that I have with many, is just making sure everybody kind of understands what is the difference between the two. Everybody's heard of one, some people have heard of the other, people have an understanding of what one means, they have a misconception of what the other is, and we just want to make sure we clarify any ambiguities that people might have. And then finally, I'll have a little brief point on what else do you need to know. So inshallah, we go through what it is, why you need one, what are some of the differences of the 2 mechanisms, and what are some of the other things that you want to consider. Okay, so inshallah, what is estate planning? So I kind of categorize this into 2 things. We split it into planning for life after death, and then planning for pre-death, right? So before you pass away. And we'll talk about a little bit about that and what that exactly means. But essentially, when we talk about planning for life after death, that's essentially you're talking and you're having this discussion that I've got assets, I've got property, I've got bank accounts, I've got real estate investments, I've got investments, whatever it might be. And the conversation you're having is, I want it to go to ABC. Obviously, for us, we've got the distributions have been prescribed. So inshallah, that's where everyone knows it has to get there. The question becomes, how does it get there? So that's the planning after death. When I pass away, what happens to my assets when I die? And the answer could be that you know where it goes, but the conversation becomes, how does it get there? And that's what we'll address. When we talk about planning for life before death, right? So your pre-death, what is it that you need to do? We get into the conversation of power of attorneys, right? Financial power of attorney and healthcare power of attorney. And my next slide will kind of discuss a little bit more about that. So what is estate planning? Again, 2 categories: post-death, pre-death. Planning for assets to transfer after you pass away. Planning for your life in situations that arise where you're unable to make certain decisions, act for yourself, but you need somebody to do that for you. That's the pre-death planning that you do. When you encompass all that together, that's what we call estate planning. Okay, so estate planning has those two components. Okay, why do we need one? We kind of had a brief intro on that too, and for us as Muslims, it's pretty straightforward. It's required, right? As we know, it says that our Prophet ﷺ said, it is not permissible for any Muslim who has something to will to stay for 2 nights without having his last will and testament written and kept ready with him. So the question on why do we need one, it's because we have to have one, right, from an Islamic perspective. Now, There's obviously other reasons that would be beneficial for all of us on wanting to establish an estate plan, right? So we know it's prescribed upon us, but you may also want to do it because it allows you the ability now, today, while you're alive, while you're competent, while you're able, to make decisions on how you want your children to be protected. If something, now one of the common questions that I ask when somebody comes and says, a common question that comes up is, when do I need to get an estate plan? When should we do this? The answer, if I'm speaking to somebody who has children or minor kids, the answer is usually given back in the form of a question. And the question is, if something happens to you today, what's going to happen to your children? Okay? That question usually prompts a lot of other follow-ups to it. So if something happens to you today and you've got minor kids, what happens to your kids? Where do they go? Who gets them? How do they get them? Where are they staying? And so on. That question alone should suffice enough to say, I need to do an estate plan. And one of the other reasons, and there's many reasons, but one of the other ones is to protect my wealth. So inshallah, everyone's got a certain amount of wealth, whatever it might be, however much it may be, but whatever you have, whatever you've earned, inshallah, throughout your life, you want to protect it, you want to preserve it, you want to make sure it gets to the right beneficiaries that you're required to send it out to. So we've established what is estate planning. Just as a quick summary, it's planning after death and planning for before death. We've established why you need an estate plan. It's prescribed. You want to protect your children, and you want to protect your wealth. Okay, so what should you consider? Right, you're at the part now where, okay, we know we've there's interest, we should do this, I want to do this. What are some of the things that we should be looking at? So part of the after-death planning, and I'm going to get into the specifics of the difference between this in the follow-up slide. But when we talk about assets, and we talk about how do I know where it goes, or I know who I want it to go to, or who needs to get it, then the question becomes, how does it get there? Right? The question of how, the execution of how that happens, comes down to the question of a will versus a trust. Right? And that's where a big focal point of this presentation is going to be, is making sure, my goal today is to make sure everybody here understands what the difference is. Right? Anytime I have any initial consult with anybody, this conversation I have here today is usually the exact same that I have when I meet with somebody. Is because my objective is that if you understand what you're getting, if you understand why you're getting it, that is much better than somebody asking you, why did you do X, and they say that my attorney told me to. Right? It's better to understand why you might be going in a certain direction with your estate. All right. Lifetime planning. Now we get into just the conversation now, do I need a financial power of attorney or do I need a healthcare power of attorney? So what is this? What are we talking about here? When we talk, if you recall the lifetime planning, this is where you want to plan for the situation where if something happens to me while I'm alive and I can no longer make decisions anymore, I'm incompetent and I can't function mentally able to. Life obviously still goes on, bills still need to be paid, things still need to happen, right? Medical bills would have to get paid and so on. But if that situation arises and you have not planned in advance, things can get very difficult for you, right? So one of the ways that you help in that planning is by designating a power of attorney. So what is a financial power of attorney? A financial power of attorney is where you have designated and appointed an agent, or what Michigan calls an attorney in fact, where now if you become incompetent or unable to make decisions, and two physicians have declared that to be the case, that individual, that agent that you have selected can now step into your shoes, make financial decisions as if you're making it yourself. That could be where they can access your bank accounts, that can be where they access your investments, any business assets, however broad or limited you have drafted that power of attorney is the control that you have given to that individual. So a common situation this applies in is when people get older and then they have kids, right? Their kids are older as well. And a lot of times what I see is that the parents would put their children, who are older and adults and whatnot, as owners of their bank account. So they would add their children to become joint on the account that they have. Now, they do this often because they say that I needed my son and daughter, or son or daughter, to have access to make payments and bills and whatnot. That is not usually the advised approach for many reasons. One of which, any individual that's an owner of an account, that account becomes exposed to the liabilities of not just yourself, but also the individuals themselves. So as a simple example, if you have a son or daughter that's a physician and the physician is now joint, well, we know physicians are always targets in lawsuits and they become exposed to potential liability. Then if a judgment is ever brought against them or any son and daughter, then any account that they are joint on even is accessible in a judgment. So that's one of the reasons why it may not be in your best interest to have that occur. Secondly, from an estate planning perspective, when you are joint on an account, automatically, under the eyes of the state, if you pass away, the person who has survived you, who is joint, automatically owns 100% of what's in that account. All right, so you have a joint owner of an account, I pass, whoever I put joint on the account now owns 100%, regardless of what your estate and your trust or your will says. You can have an estate plan that says that my kids get 100, I have 3 kids, and let's say you have 3 kids, they get split all 3 equally, for example. But if you have one of your children joint on an account, that supersedes anything you've written in your estate plan. So that's an important part to consider when people are making that decision. Because obviously, inshallah, we all hope that our families and our kids are all going to get along. Doing what I've been doing and how long I've been doing it, I've seen the other side of what happens, and unfortunately, a lot changes when parents pass and kids are around and there's money involved. We see this a lot, unfortunately. So reality is there. The planning is what you have control over. So putting your children joint on an account may not always be advised. So what is the approach, right? We say, okay, well, if we can't do that, then what can we do? Well, that's where the power of attorney comes in, right? You draft a power of attorney that gives your child the ability to step in your shoes, to act as you would act and have access to things, but they don't own it. They also then have a fiduciary responsibility on how they manage or access and use those funds, right? So now there's laws that protect you as a parent, that if those funds are being misused by somebody who's a power of attorney. Whereas if you're joint on an account and your child takes all the money out, no law is protecting you from that because they own it just as much as you do. So just something that, inshallah, we always hope not to have to consider, but it happens. These power of attorneys can be drafted in broadly, where you can give somebody complete scope, broad scope and control over everything, or very narrow. It could be limited. It could be for an indefinite period of time. It could be for a limited period of time, right? So if you're traveling overseas, you need somebody to sell your house for you, for example, or whatever it might be, you can give somebody access then. What happens if we don't do this? So we get into this whole conversation is planning, lifetime planning. So what happens if you don't have a power of attorney, but a situation arises where you now are, incompetent, or you get older, you have Alzheimer's, dementia, and whatnot. And now if you need somebody to access your account, your spouse and your kids, if you have an account that's in your name, in your personal name, your spouse and your kids cannot just go and access the account. The bank will not and should not allow that. They then have to apply for a guardianship and a conservatorship over you, meaning they go through the court process. And when you go through that process, it's court, so it takes a while, it can get costly, and it can unfortunately get ugly as well, right? Because it's not easy to get a guardian over somebody, because you're asking the court to appoint you to control this person's life and control their finances. So in that situation, what the court does is they appoint an attorney to represent you, the person who has the mental incapacity, to represent you to make sure that if your child is trying to get guardianship over you, then they have to prove why. They have to prove to the court, and they have to prove to the attorney, the attorney that's representing you. So that process can take a while. So that is where the lifetime planning comes in, right? So it's important to make sure, and this is a document, a lot of times when people think of estate planning, they really just get fixated on a will and think that everything is complete, without realizing that there are other documents that are just as important of this whole plan. Healthcare power of attorney. So that's very similar to the financial, except we're talking about medical decisions now, right? So you're now selecting somebody to be able to make medical decisions on your behalf when you're unable to do it yourself, right? So same concept now is just about from the medical side. So collectively, the financial power of attorney and the healthcare power of attorney are two vital documents when it comes to an estate plan. All right, so next, what else should you consider? Kids planning. I mentioned earlier that the question when asked when should I do a plan, then it's responded with another question that if you have kids, what happens to your children? Well, this is a time where everybody has to be able to decide who do they want to select to raise their children if something happens, right? That's where we get into the guardianship and conservatorship of your kids, where you and your spouse are deciding collectively that if something happens to us, who do we trust, who do we select to take our kids into their home and raise them under the same morals and values that we would raise our own if they were with us. That's the opportunity you have now. Without doing this planning in advance, you leave it in the court's hands to decide and hope that somebody A steps up to take over your kids, and if there's multiple people arguing, then you're leaving it to the court to decide who is most qualified to do it. And for all you know, you may have known in your life that I would never want either of them to be the ones to do it. And we have that sometimes. Sometimes people say their siblings are not the ones that they would like for their kids to be with, and for whatever it might be. So everyone's family dynamics are different. The point is, you have the ability to plan for that now and be able to choose who that's going to be, rather than letting it sit with a third party and hope somebody steps up and wants to raise your kids. So alhamdulillah, this is when we talk about lifetime planning, talk about the power of attorneys, making sure you're protecting yourself, that when you're alive, I trust somebody to access my finances. I trust this person to make medical decisions for me. I'm not leaving it in a third party to step up to get themselves appointed over me, nor am I going to leave it to the courts to do that. Guardianship, conservatorship. I'm deciding now who do I want to select to raise my kids that are going to raise them in the same way that me and my wife would raise them. They share the same values, same morals, same Islamic values. That's the household we would select. That's the decision you're making when you're doing your lifetime planning. Okay, so this is where we get into the planning after death. And what happens oftentimes, many times, everybody knows and has heard of a will, right? Your last will and testament. That's the most common estate planning document that people are aware of. Also, when we talk about a trust, there's always this misconception with a trust, right? It's either, it's extremely costly to do a trust, or you have to be extremely wealthy to have a trust. So those are some of the stigma that I want to change, and the perception that I want to change from today's conversation, inshallah. So, and I'm not, as I speak, it may come across that one might be a more superior product than the other, but that's not meant to be the case, because really, truly, it really depends on everybody's situation, right? And it depends on your objectives and what you are specifically wanting and needing. But it's important to understand how these two work. Because obviously, a lot of times, you can go online, you can get a will and get it done for free, and people think the estate plan is complete, and it could very well be. But what does that mean? when you go online and you get a will and you sign it and you keep it now, in your drawer, what have you actually done? What happens after that when you actually, when you pass away? So that's where I want to touch on a little bit here. So the main distinction between a will and a trust is in one word, and that's probate. Right? If I was to summarize it in one word, probate is the main distinction between a will and a trust. So what is probate? Probate is the court process. It's the process that governs your estate. So just to back up for a second and how this works, right? So, and I know we have Q&A at the end, but if I'm not explaining something clearly, and we can notate it, I can always refer back to it at the end. But inshallah, please let me know if I'm hoping that I'm explaining this clear. So when you are alive and you own an asset, and let's take the simple example of a bank account. Okay, the bank account, as everyone has, you see your name written as the owner, right? On your check, you see your name written. You are the owner of that account. The money that's in that account, you own it. When you die, you no longer own that account. Your estate owns that account now. Okay? So the estate is the owner of the account, of the asset upon your death. Not you individually or personally, because you're no longer around. The estate now owns it. Not your spouse, not the kids, none of your beneficiaries at this point own that asset. It is the estate. Okay? So now, understanding that part, when we talk about probate, the objective of probate, whereas you open up a probate estate, is where the courts now have to validate whatever estate will, if you drafted a will, whatever will you may have, validate the will, make sure everything is fine, it meets the laws of the state and how it was created, signed, witnessed, and whatnot. Then you can start dispersing the funds and the assets that are inside. Okay, so what does that look like? Let's just take an example. So you have a will and you pass away. Your spouse now takes the will, goes to probate, goes to court, opens up what they call a probate estate. Okay? Now, somebody has to represent that estate, right? The personal representative is the name given to the person who represents your estate. Your will designates who you have selected. So that person's role is to do just that. Take my will, go to court, open up an estate, make sure that the will say who the beneficiaries and whatnot are. Make sure then you distribute it accordingly. Okay? When you do that process, and I'll mention one other thing just as a rule of thumb with all of this. The rule of thumb is any asset that you have titled in your personal name, okay, any asset you have titled in your personal name goes through probate. Okay? So if you have a bank account in your name, you pass away, it goes through probate. You have your house that's in your name, pass away, it goes through probate. So any asset in your personal name goes through probate. So when you pass, your personal representative, what they do is they take your will, they go to court, they open up an estate, then the court says, we need an inventory. We need an inventory of everything that this deceased owned. Okay? They provide that list. Bank account, house, fidelity account, investment, a car, whatever it might be. Along with that, the court asks, we need to know what the value of all of that is. Okay? So bank account, 20,000, house, whatever, 200,000, and so on. Then the court says, great, now pay us an inventory fee. Okay? So the court takes a fee of that amount. And the fee is usually anywhere from about 0.5% to 0.75%-ish around, depending on how much you have. So there's a fee that the court takes. After they take that fee, and after they validate and go through the whole process, you're now getting into about, if it's Wayne County and whatnot, probate takes about 6 months plus for it to be completed. Right? And this is all, inshallah, hoping that no one's contesting the will either. Right? That no other beneficiary is stepping up and saying, hey, I'm supposed to get more than what I'm entitled to and whatnot. So if none of that happens and it goes as smooth as it possibly could, you're still talking anywhere from 4 to 6+ months for it to get complete. Now, I'm giving a simple example of a bank account and a house, right? Then we can get into the complex of what probate can consist of is if you own real estate, if you own a business, if you have a practice, right? All of that will factor in, and all of that becomes a conversation of an estate plan as well. And what happens to those and how does that get equated? If you've got real estate investments, you gotta get those appraised, put that all in. And when we say appraised value, it's gross. Okay, so it's the gross value of the asset is what they take a percentage of. So if you own any debt on it, they don't net it and then say, give us the net. No, it's on the gross. So and as I was getting to this by saying earlier that you can do a will online, and that's great, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's understanding what does that actually mean for you personally, right? Is that the best approach for you personally? That yes, you got it online, you have it, it's in your drawer and it's complete, and it may get validated, everything can go great, but it can cost you, it's a variable cost, right? Because the more you pass away with, the more you'll be paying in that fee as an inventory. So the other parts to this that people are not always aware of is that probate is its own public information. Now, this is a subjective value. Some people might care, some people may not care. You know, I've had mixed feelings on that from people, but it's public. Anybody can go in, see what you had, what assets you had, who your beneficiaries are, how much is what, it's court's all public, right? So if somebody wanted to. Now, again, that's a subjective evaluation on that, or how important it may be to you. Cost may be high, and that depends on what you have, right? The value of what you actually have. Then we get into inconvenience to the heirs. This becomes an inconvenience to the heirs because it could be that it could take them 6, 7, 8, 9 months for them to receive anything from the estate, right? Just depending on how long the court takes. If somebody's contesting the will, and I always mention it, if anybody contests an estate, there's only one person that wins when it's being contested in court. Who would that be?
The court.
You said the lawyer. The lawyer is the only person that wins. Why? Because if you're contesting the estate has to defend it. Well, the attorney gets paid from the estate, meaning all the beneficiaries are now getting less money because you essentially added the attorney as a beneficiary. So it's not in the heir's best interest to fight amongst themselves for the most part, right? When you are contesting the estate's not gonna, the representative of the estate's not gonna take money out of their own pocket to defend the estate. The estate gets an attorney for